All right, well, my clock says 9 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started with the introductions. And welcome and thank you everyone for attending our webinar today on getting on board with ride sharing. My name is Wendy Green and I am the director of IJET University. The webinar will look at the challenges and questions that travel managers and security managers may have when considering whether to offer ride sharing as an alternative to other transportation providers. Then we will have a case study from Lyft in an effort to understand how the ride-sharing industry is addressing these concerns. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to our presenters. Theresa Thomas is the Senior Vice President of the Powered by IJET Business Unit and responsible for building partnerships to enable organizations to deliver insight through IJET's people and location-centric intelligence and services. During her 20-plus year career, Theresa has worked in numerous companies across the travel industry, including several leadership positions within the B2B and B2C environments. Most recently, these include Chief Marketing Officer with a leading travel publisher, President of her own strategic marketing firm, and 13-plus years highlighted by recruitment, promotion, and retention by leading firms including American Express, Federal Express, and AT&T. In addition, we have 3 subject matter experts from Lyft. We have Jaden Robinson, who is the Director of Corporate Travel Solutions. Jaden builds Lyft's custom solutions for Fortune 500 travel managers. We have Melissa Gale, who is Senior Manager of the Insurance Solutions. And Melissa, Insurance and Risk Analyst, managing insurance programs for the Lyft community. And then we also have David Mack. David is Director of Government Affairs, and he works with policymakers and regulatory bodies to ensure compliance and drive safety for the Lyft community. So with that, Theresa, I'd like to pass this to you.
Thanks, Wendy, and thanks everyone again for joining us on this morning's call. I couldn't be more excited, actually, to be presenting on the topic that we have today. As a group, I have presented on similar panels and discussions as part of GBTA last year in Orlando. I was just actually in Texas last week doing a presentation as well on a broader, more sharing economy suppliers in general, which included ground transportation. So there's no doubt, and I get requests quite often, as does IJET, to talk about this topic from a safety and security perspective for travelers and travel buyers. So this is definitely a conversation that is going to persist, I think, as we move into 2016 and 2017. I was saying the other day that I think the good news for all of us who have been in this industry for quite some time, and myself either directly in travel or related industries for over 18 years, is that we are an industry that's used to change and evolution. And I think this is one of those unique times in our industry where we are seeing some of the change and evolution being driven by these, what we would maybe traditionally put into a non-traditional supplier category bucket. And at the end of the day, while there is a lot of, I think, emotion sometimes around this topic, and you know, people feel a little uncomfortable by some of the questions that it raises, what I can tell you as someone who's been focusing on this for about the last 12 to 18 months is that we continue to evolve and grow in the discussion. It wasn't even a year ago in Orlando when we were having this discussion as an industry group when there were more questions than there were answers, to be perfectly frank. And what we've seen develop just in the last 6 months from the different suppliers, and Lyft obviously being a key one of those, and is going to talk about some of their things today, is tremendous growth in response to the feedback that you all have been giving them around how they can develop their offerings for the corporate market and for a B2B value proposition. So in order to kind of work through today's discussion, what we've done is we've framed the conversation around some key assumptions. And we're going to drill into these a little bit as we go through, and then Lyft is going to take you through as well some specifics around their business-to-business offering, which I think is very interesting and something that you definitely all want to hear. From an assumptions perspective, the first one we're going to make is that this market is growing. We're going to talk a little bit about how much and how many of the travelers are embracing it. Fundamentally, I think we need to decide, is change good or bad? Hopefully, I would rather make the positive assumption that change is good. And third, that the sharing economy suppliers are listening, and they want to address the corporate buyer safety and security needs. So kind of keying in then on the change is good assumption. I think, again, going back to my earlier comment, as an industry, we are used to seeing evolutions and changes. And sometimes I think, having been to years and years of GBTAs and education sessions and being in different conversations with buyers, sometimes we feel like we don't have enough change. So I'm not sure if we always know, what do we really want, because in the industry, when we look at the kind of food chain of suppliers and relationships, sometimes I hear our criticisms around, well, we haven't had enough change. There hasn't been enough innovation or evolution. And in other cases, when we do see change happening, it starts to feel uncomfortable and we question it. But I think overall, as an industry, we need to approach this from the perspective that disruption is a good thing. Disruption typically drives new solutions. It drives conversations and discussions in the marketplace that ultimately, at the end of the day, create a competitive environment. And that's where I think sometimes it gets a little uncomfortable because we're not sure how to place one supplier or vendor against another one, and what does this really mean to us, and how should we be responding or reacting to that. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I think as buyers and whether traditional or non-traditional suppliers, the result ends up positively for not just the companies and the corporations who have the programs to manage, but also those travelers who are going out on the road every day looking for more efficient, less disruptive, more value in the travel experience. So ultimately, all of the kind of changes and discussions and unanswered questions result in a positive outcome for our industry, and I think we've seen that time and time again. So I just would encourage everyone to approach today's discussion, and as we move into 2016, with keeping that in mind, because I think if we all support that type of dialogue, in the end, we're all going to be better for it. This is something, managed means aligned to corporate needs. This gets to that assumption around, do the ground transport sharing economy suppliers understand what a managed travel program is? And there was a lot of discussion, 6-9 months ago around this. Some of the things I used to hear were, well, these were consumer-based or consumer-driven models. How can they work in a corporate space? Were they built to do that? Do they understand our unique needs, things like, discounting, and that we can't deal with certain pricing, or we don't want to because that creates a liability or risk for the organization because we can't control the price of this transportation. The fact that as corporates we need to have reporting and visibility into, where are the dollars going in our program and how can we manage them better, and do these solutions provide that type of visibility for us to be effective in our jobs. Innovation and the experience, again, I think from a corporate perspective, there are different needs, unique needs, from a servicing, from a communications perspective, and how do these suppliers address or support that. And then the fourth thing you see here, which is probably the nearest and dearest to my heart, is the corporate responsibility, traveler safety, liability, insurance, and risk. Obviously, when we're dealing with business travel, we have different responsibilities for those travelers than if we are consumers out there making these choices to get into a shared servicing supplier vehicle. So it is critically important as we move forward in today's discussion, and it will be a big part of the discussion from myself as well as the folks on the call from Lyft, to create a better understanding about how they are addressing specifically kind of this corporate responsibility, safety and security, and some of the insurance questions that have come up around their program for Lyft. And again, I think you're going to be very surprised and in a good way about what is there. And in many cases, not only is it as good as what you're getting from your suppliers that you're probably more used to, your traveler is using, but it in some cases is far better. And I think we need to, again, hopefully this will drive change so that all suppliers, raise the bar on what they can offer. A few ground transportation facts. I think this is just amazing. It always makes me question, gosh, do I want to go be in that business? I mean, think of a business or an industry that has gone in the last 3 to 4 years from, representing $0 in expenditures to over $1 billion industry. It is amazing when you think about the growth of this. Recently at the Texas BTA, I was presenting, and during the keynote opening session, the person on stage from GBTA asked the question, can everybody raise your hand who have travelers today going or using shared services suppliers? And this was a huge chapter, about 300 people in the room. And I think almost every one of those people, if not close to every one of them, raised their hand and said, yeah, there is some base of my travelers that are using these suppliers. And then the follow-on question to that was, how many of you today have incorporated the non-traditional ground transport suppliers into your managed travel programs where you've sat down and started to have that conversation? And maybe 3 people out of that total of 300 raised their hand. So it says to me, again, when you look at the hard facts of just the dollars and cents of this as an industry overall and how it has grown, that's one area obviously to consider. But also when you look at all of our peers and colleagues that sit in this industry and you see such a huge response to the engagement that's happening across organizations today, big, medium, and small, around these types of suppliers and partnerships. And then, again, a very different response when we look at where they are in the travel program. I think we all can probably agree that this is not a trend. It's not something that probably is going to go away or change in the next 6 to 9 months. This is something that is being widely adopted, widely utilized, and we do have to find answers and ways to work together. Today, just kind of from a footprint standpoint, I thought it was interesting to note, Lyft is available in over 190 cities, and soon that's going to increase so where they're going to be providing service close to half the world's population through 2 key partnerships with Didi and Ola. And they'll talk a little bit more about that, but again, showing how the footprint of these services are being expanded. 20% of Americans have tried ride-sharing today, and a vast majority of those have had what they call great experiences when they were surveyed. I'm a little personally surprised by that number. That is a true fact. But if I just look at the people that kind of I know and interact with, certainly in a business setting, that number, the 20%, would probably be far higher than that. And then 57% of business travelers opt for ride-sharing services. So again, an important statistic to note, because for, it wasn't probably 9 months ago, people were going, yeah, that's really just a consumer thing. That's what people do, when they're going somewhere on the weekend and they need a car service. People don't really use it for business. Business travelers aren't making those choices. So, it wasn't all that long ago, a year ago or so, where, that's kind of how we were writing these things off. But we've got more than half of the business travelers today out there who are opting in for these services when they travel. A few ground transportation considerations and facts, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this because really what I want you to hear is not the checklist, but how does Lyft deliver against this checklist. And this would be a checklist that all of you would want to use in your conversations with any of the ground transport providers in the shared economy space. You want to drive discussions and understand their offerings when it comes to things like insurance, background checks and standards. What are the maintenance standards they require for their drivers on their vehicles? What kinds of training is required, and not just to become a driver, but what kind of training ongoing do they require, and how do they kind of police or audit that to make sure that those things are happening? And when they don't, what processes do they have in place to ensure that that driver is either suspended or put on hold from driving until they have, met again the requirements. And then talk to them about things like surge pricing and the cost of the rides, and get the facts on how you can work with them in certain markets if you have a higher demand from your traveling base, to make sure that they have enough inventory there to support your travelers without possibly having to roll into that kind of surge pricing model. So have those conversations. Don't be afraid to ask those hard questions. They want to help work with you on the solution. From a facts perspective, there's a lot of conversation that has happened and is continuing to happen around insurance coverage, specifically for ground transport providers. Again, I'm not going to go into this in detail. Lyft is going to cover that in the next upcoming slides, but do talk to any of the, in your conversations with any of the ground transport shared economy suppliers, what are your insurance coverages, and what exactly does that cover my organization and the individuals getting into those vehicles for. And then from a terms and conditions, again, make sure you're looking at the details of these contracts and understanding, how they support your organizations, how you're indemnified against certain things if worst-case scenarios happen, and really work across your organization if you need to bring in your legal and your procurement teams to make sure that they understand the services that are going to be provided and the coverages. From safety and security perspective, things that I think are key and again, unique to these providers. And for myself personally, who's used many of them, these aren't services when I get into a taxi, as an example, that I have. I don't know who's going to be picking me up. I don't know what his name is. I don't know if he's got, if it's the vehicle I'm supposed to be getting in. Having that information, especially as a traveler when you're out, and especially probably if you're a female traveler, and you're traveling in cities a lot of times where you may or may not be that familiar, knowing who's going to be picking you up when you come out of the office or come out of dinner or come out of your hotel gives you a tremendous peace of mind that you're going to be taken care of. Because if nothing else, you know that also everybody else knows that you've been picked up by them. You can share your ETA and do those types of things so that you have a level of confidence about the person who's driving the vehicle you're getting in. The next bullet, again, I'm not going to go into details about this because Lyft has some specifics, but it's important from a safety perspective that it's not just you who knows where you're going and where you started from and where you're supposed to end up, but you can share that information with anyone who might be expecting you to arrive at another location or to a family member. So if you're going from the green pinpoint to the red pinpoint, not only can you see your path, but by sharing your ETA, so can other people who would care about your safety and security and make sure that you are headed in the direction you need to go. Or if they see something that doesn't feel right or look right, they can be communicating with you and you can be sending messaging back. And then obviously tracking your journey using the mobile phone GPS is the capability or the functionality that allows that capability to happen. So at this point, I will stop because that was just more of a general kind of industry overview and where we are and how I've seen some developments and evolution around this topic. And I will ask that the Lyft team take over the presentation from here. And the first person who will be speaking from Lyft is Jaden. And Jaden, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you, Theresa. We are really excited to be on the call and share with all you guys a little bit more about Lyft, our corporate travel solution, and most specifically the safety policies that we put in place since we launched. So again, just want to echo what Theresa said. She went over a lot of this in terms of at a macro level, the fact that ride sharing has been growing a lot over the last couple of years. And this chart just corroborates that, showing the pink trend line is ride sharing, the black and gray trend lines representing taxi and rental car. And we think that there's 4 main reasons why ride-sharing is becoming more and more popular, specifically to the business traveler. So one, it's safer, and in the subsequent slides, we will go into a lot more detail around the safety policies that we put in place. Number 2, it's 30% less expensive than cabs and around 50% less expensive than black cars. So if you as a travel manager know what you guys are currently spending on taxis, on black cars, on other ground transportation suppliers, it's pretty easy to calculate what the total savings opportunity can be if you start shifting a lot of your spend from these other suppliers over to Lyft. Number three, the user experience is more enjoyable and convenient. So as I'm sure a lot of you guys know, one of the big themes in 2016 in travel management is the traveler experience. So what can the travel manager do to continue to make travel more enjoyable, more seamless, more easy for their travelers? And I don't think many travel managers can remember the last time one of their employees said, I just had the most amazing cab experience of my life. But I think what a lot of travelers like about Lyft and other ride-sharing services is the ease of use. And no longer do they need to dread that process of getting to their next meeting or to the conference or to the airport. It's a much more enjoyable experience. And lastly, it saves a lot of time on expense reports. So no one in their right mind enjoys the expense report process. So with our e-receipt functionality, we have an integration with one of the primary expense management companies. So it's saving the traveler a lot of time on their expense reports. And also, we can then funnel this data both to travel managers and risk managers so they have a much better understanding of what their ground transportation spend is, and from a duty of care standpoint, where their employees are at all times. Thank you. So now just taking a step back for a second in case any of you have not had a chance to try Lyft yet, in terms of how it works. So you open up the app, you set your pickup location. Once you set your pickup location, you click the Request Lyft button, and when you request a Lyft, it sends out a notice to our nearest available driver, and they have a few seconds to accept your ride request. It usually takes around 2 to 3 minutes from the time that you request a Lyft to the time that your driver picks you up from your pickup location. And once they pick you up, they take you to your destination, and using the GPS technology that we have embedded within the app, they take you on the fastest and most affordable and safest route. And once they take you to your destination, there's no physical exchange of payment like you see in a cab where you're rummaging through your wallet for cash. It's all seamless. So you've already entered your credit card information into the app. So it's seamless in the sense that you can simply thank your driver for the ride and hop out of the Lyft. And then one final step, which is a really important component of the process, is our two-way rating system. So at the end of every single ride, the passenger rates the driver out of 5 stars, and the driver also rates the passenger out of 5 stars. And the reason why this is so important is that it helps us create a system with a lot more accountability and transparency. So we actually off-board any of our drivers who drops below a 4.6 out of 5 star rating. So this is just one of the many things that we do to make sure that every single time one of your employees gets into a Lyft, that they are incredibly safe and that the driver who's picked them up has been very well approved by all of their previous passengers. Thanks. So just a quick high-level overview of where we are, and Theresa had mentioned some of these. We are available in over 190 U.S. cities, and we recently formed partnerships where a Lyft user will be able to use the Lyft app in over half of the world. So we formed partnerships with the leading rideshare providers in India, in China, in Southeast Asia. So like I said, you can now use the Lyft app in a lot more locations. So a couple of slides ago, we went over kind of why ride-sharing in general has become a lot more popular. Thankfully, Lyft is also the fastest growing ride-sharing provider in the United States, and we attribute this fast growth to a few things. One, potentially most importantly, is the priority that we've always placed on safety. And we will go into a lot more detail on our background checks and our insurance policies, but our founders, John and Logan, recognized from the day that they started Lyft that if Lyft was going to be successful, that it had to be incredibly safe and that passengers had to feel safe every single time they hopped into a Lyft. And currently, 30% of our drivers are female, 60% of our passengers are female, 7% of our passengers say that they feel very safe with a Lyft. And I think that the fact that such a large percentage of both our driver and passenger bases are females is a testament to all of the different safety policies that we've put in place over the years. Secondly is the collaborative approach that we've taken not just to our enterprise partnerships, but also with all of the government entities across the country and now the world. So I think there's a big myth out there that, sometimes ride-sharing providers are operating illegally. I can't speak to our competition, but what I can say is that Lyft is 100% legal in all of the markets that we're operating in, and we've been fully approved by those municipalities. It's always been a priority at Lyft to work very closely with those entities and to make sure that they fully understand the Lyft business model, they support Lyft, and they really understand the positive impact that we're having on their community. And lastly, we've tried really hard to always stay true to the mission and values that John and Logan built Lyft upon. And to mention a few of them, corporate social responsibility, so making sure we're always doing business the right way, having a positive impact on the environment, and also all of the initiatives that we've put in place around female safety to make sure that Lyft is constantly the transportation provider that women feel most safe using. So over the years, we've taken a very holistic approach to safety. So while everything listed on this slide are very important on their own, it's really the combination of all of them that's what's made Lyft the safe platform that it is today. So our background checks, David will go into a lot more detail about our background check process in a couple slides. Our $1 million insurance policy, our insurance lead, Melissa, will go into greater detail about this on the next slide. 19-point vehicle inspection. So before any driver applicant hits the road as a Lyft driver, they have to pass a 19-point vehicle inspection. And I won't bore you with all 19 points, but the inspection ensures that the driver's brakes, lights, tires, seatbelts, etc. are in perfect working condition before they give their first ride. Two-way rating system, talked about this before, but again, just want to reiterate how important this piece is to our entire system and how seriously we take the feedback of both our passengers and our drivers. One thing that I didn't mention before is that anytime you or one of your employees gives their driver a rating of 3 or fewer stars, our algorithm kicks in and you'll never be matched with that driver again. Driver and car photo identification. So Theresa mentioned this before, but once a driver accepts your ride request, you see a photo of the driver, you see a photo of the car, you see their license plate number, so that as they're approaching, it's very easy to identify who your driver is. And you can also call and text the driver as well while they're on their way to make sure that they know where you are, know the best place to pick you up, to make sure that they can meet any of your individual unique needs. And lastly, in-person driver vetting process, which is a very important differentiator for Lyft and something that has been valued very highly by all the enterprise partners that we work with. So before any driver applicant becomes a driver, they have to meet with an existing Lyft driver who has a very good record, and that existing driver vets the new driver from a safety standpoint, most importantly, but also to make sure that that driver can provide you and your employees with a very enjoyable, safe, professional experience. So we know that over the years, every company that we worked with has worked really hard to build a very strong values and culture within their company, and we feel like every time an employee hops into a Lyft, it's an extension of their workday, and we feel like we should uphold the values and the culture that you guys have worked so hard to build. And one of the ways that we can be confident this is happening is through this in-person driver vetting process, and we feel like if we didn't have this as part of the onboarding flow for drivers, that we'd see the quality of our drivers would go down significantly. So now I'll pass it off to Melissa on the next slide to talk about our insurance policy.
Thanks, Jaden. So I think before I get started to talk about insurance, it's important to quickly sort of overview the different stages of a Lyft ride because we do have different policies based on the various stages. So in the diagram here, you'll see sort of the pink is period 1, or we call driver mode, and this is when a driver has their application on and is available to receive a ride request. And then the blue goes into period 2 and 3, also called passenger mode, and that is when a driver has accepted a ride request and is en route to pick up a passenger and then ultimately has the passenger in their vehicle and is taking them to their destination. So in period 1, which is when a driver just simply has their app on, so they do not have a passenger in the vehicle, we have various policies throughout the state, varying between contingent policy and a primary policy. around the limits of $50,000 per person, $100,000 per accident, and $25,000 for property damage. But most importantly, I think, is periods 2 and 3. So when they're en route to pick up the passenger, i.e. your employee, or they're in the vehicle and taking them to their destination, we have a first of its kind $1 million auto insurance policy. And so this is going to cover any liability that the driver may cause and cover those damages for not only your passenger but as well as any third parties. In addition to the $1 million auto liability policy, and I think this is sort of a key highlight, is our UM/UIM uninsured, underinsured motorist coverage for $1 million. And so what this does is it provides that added protection to your passenger, or to our passenger, your employee, for any damages that are sustained while in the ride for an at-fault party other than our driver. So if the driver is involved in a hit and run, we have the $1 million uninsured motorist coverage, or if they're involved in an accident with an at-fault party who carries limits that are well below our $1 million policy, our policy would ultimately kick in above those limits. We also provide $50,000 comp and collision for the drivers for any damage to the vehicle outside of those limits. And I think another really key point here is that as we continue to grow, and you've sort of seen the expansion into multiple markets and cities, we've enacted a TNC compromise model bill, and TNC stands for Transportation Network Company. And what it is it mandates limits for us across the U.S. And it's supported by not only us as well as Uber, but also very large insurance carriers, State Farm, Allstate, USAA, Farmers, etc. And the bill requires set limits for a TNC, so as Lyft, in various periods of the ride. And we follow that bill in over 29 different states and continue to see it adopted as we grow into other jurisdictions. So it really sort of highlights the limits that we have available, and the policies are being adopted in the U.S. And with that, I will shoot it over to David.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to speak with you. I'd like to back up just a moment. My name is David Mack. I'm the Director of Public Affairs over here at Lyft, and sometimes it's set to reflect where we are today. We've done a little bit of history of the company, but we were just discussing internally. We are just about to cross over slightly more than 4 years of regulation of this industry by the California CPUC, which was the first regulatory body to set concrete rules in place to govern how it works. That body of rules and laws and regulations has since been taken up and molded into state law across the nation. And we've just crossed over the threshold where we're looking at over 2/3 of states in the country now have ride-sharing specific laws in place which mandate things like background checks, transparency, accountability, vehicle inspections, etc. So it moves very fast, and as a lot of you know, moving through the government, the policy process is slow, but it's good to understand how much time and thought has gone into this. And so we've covered a little bit of this before, but it is important to also think about how background checks are done as a holistic sense. So in creating these rules and working with the CPUC, we realized immediately that Lyft is not itself going to be performing background checks, and that we needed to go to experts that knew what they were doing here. And so we partnered with an organization called Sterling Background Check, which is an independent, credentialed Fortune 100 company which conducts background checks on behalf of other Fortune 100 companies, municipalities, and etc. And what these experts did is came in and helped us design a security program that they could do themselves, independent, arm's length from us, to make sure that the verification process is thorough, embedded, and safe, so that it stood up to the inspections of regulators and policymakers across the country. In addition to these background checks, and Jaden and others have covered these before, we learned to make a holistic system, because what the experts told us was background checks are important and they're absolutely necessary, but they in themselves are no guarantor of safety. A background check is a one-time spot of past history, but it is not specifically predictive of future behavior or anyone who may have a bad day or things that go wrong. So in addition to that, we've layered on the unparalleled issues of transparency and accountability. And when you take all these things holistically, that is what is getting us recommendations from a strong consumer base, from that driver base of 30% of women as drivers, which is unparalleled in any other transportation industry, and a majority of riders at 60% riding with Lyft that feel it is safe and fundamentally different from any other offerings on the market. So that's how we got here. A little bit about what Sterling Background Check does for us. Once they have credentialed information that has been run through a human process of verifying the information, are looking for all types of background information. They are searching through federal, state, county, and Department of Justice sex register offender lists for any instances of violence, sexual offenses, felonies, drug-related issues, any of a number of very specific issues that would prevent someone from being able to come on the system. The interesting thing about conducting background checks via Sterling Background Check and via the SSN and name-based trace versus the fingerprint system, which tends to be used by state and local municipal-based agencies when they conduct them on their own, is that our checks do not stop at the state borders. If you look at our individuals in the tax industry or other traditional livery, if you're, for example, applying for a California driver's license, that background check will be done by a city that you're applying for, and it will look no further than the borders of the state. And this happens across the country. Our system looks at the local, at the state, as well as at the federal system, so it goes much further beyond and is more likely to cause any kind of infractions that have happened in other places for folks that have moved in from out of state. And for that reason, that's how we believe that we've gotten such a high trust level with the public. But going back to the transparency and accountability, the background checks are necessary, but it is really unparalleled, and this is why the safety is the biggest innovation. That picture of the driver, the picture of the vehicle license plate, GPS tracking, all of that being automatically emailed in a digital receipt to a rider after every single ride is a great discourager of bad behavior. Similarly, the accountability, that real-time rating system that Jaden talked about, where the driver and the rider are giving immediate feedback after every single ride. The immediate offboarding, which is triggered by algorithms, which are looking for keywords in those reviews, say, smelled like smoke, it smelled like alcohol, driver seemed unsafe, I have very serious concerns. All of those trigger an immediate offboarding of the driver in real time so that they can no longer drive on the platform for that evening until they go through a safety check with a dedicated 24/7 trust and safety team, which is also not found in any other industry. At any time, an individual who has concerns can pick up their phone and go directly to a team of humans based here that will answer their problems. We also have dedicated teams that work as liaisons directly with law enforcement officers. And the law enforcement officers have talked to us about basically what they call a two-box system. So, you know, it's not a nice thing to talk about, but things can happen in any given system. And so what you try and do is engineer for the least possible exposure. When you look at traditional transportation providers, it is an anonymous process. It involves cash transactions. It makes it difficult for people to identify each other and very difficult to recall who provided the service. In that box, if something untoward happens, recourse is very difficult because a passenger may not be able to talk about all those details. However, if something untoward happens in a box where you're riding with a TNC or Lyft, accountability is very easy and justice is very easy, and helping to untangle knotty problems is significantly easier. And that is why law enforcement, when asked, will say, look, background checks, very important, but a holistic system is really where you want to look, and that's why we've seen such success across the nation, why what started in California 4 years ago has now been adopted in the majority of cities across the country, and why we now see growing success. So happy to answer any questions, but with that I think we'll move on to the next slide.
Thanks, David. So when thinking about data, one of the most consistent pieces of feedback that we've got from both risk and travel managers since we launched our B2B platform was that there wasn't data that was available to them in terms of what their total ground transportation spend is, or from a duty of care standpoint, real-time analytics to know where their employees were at all times. And I think the reason why travel managers didn't have access to this data was pretty simple. The taxi industry, as you guys know, is so fragmented. So all of your travelers are using hundreds, if not thousands, of different cab companies. And as a result, it never made sense for a travel manager to partner with one cab company. They simply didn't have the coverage that would warrant having that relationship. But now with services like Lyft, where we operate in 190 U.S. cities, we're serving over half of the world's population, finally a travel manager can work with one ground transportation supplier who can provide them with all of this data that they've been looking for a while. So with all this feedback, we've built in a lot of custom reporting capabilities. We're in the process of building out a dashboard just so that both travel managers and risk managers can have access to this data that they've been looking for a while. So we've gone over a lot of this throughout the presentation, but again, just want to reiterate the collaborative approach that we've taken to these enterprise partnerships. We know that for the most part, a travel manager's priorities from one company to the next are relatively similar. The requirements and needs of a company may be different, and that's why we don't think that a one-size-fits-all solution is appropriate for a solution like this. The one priority that remains consistent from travel manager to travel manager and from company to company is the importance on employee safety and security. And hopefully, from David sharing about background checks, Melissa sharing about insurance, and the previous slide before, you guys all have a little bit of a better understanding of our safety policies, the attention that we've given safety and security since day one, and how we're planning on continuing to innovate to make sure that Lyft continues to be the safest option for you and your employees. So I'll pass it off to Theresa, who will wrap things up.
Thank you. So as we look kind of at what's next and forward into 2016, I think the things that we need to kind of continue to ask ourselves and look for answers from companies like Lyft on are what are they doing and how are they continuing to evolve solutions in their platforms to meet and your travelers' needs and your organizational needs around safety and security. You've heard a number of things today from the Lyft team. Again, I encourage you to continue that dialogue, ask more questions, bring in other people from your organization who may be expert. I know for myself, having had a number of conversations with Lyft over the last few weeks, I'm learning a whole lot around insurance coverages, which is not my area of expertise, but there are people inside my company who know a whole lot about that. So, bring those people into the discussion because, again, I think that you've heard today that the experts do exist on the Lyft side. There are people who understand what the nuances and challenges and risks are, and they're putting solutions in place to address that. So continue to look for those evolutions and ask them how they're building out their programs. The other thing that I think is important is to continue to watch how these traditional or standard suppliers are working in conjunction or in parallel. Compare those things side by side to see how does the pricing differ? How do discounts differ? How do cancellation policies differ? Again, we hear time and time like it's more expensive and you hear a lot about surge pricing, but some of the facts that you heard today at least should give you a pause to say, maybe it's not. Maybe as a general rule, it's actually less expensive. And there are those instances where things like surge pricing can come into play, but here's how I can have a conversation with the supplier to try to mitigate the risk or exposure that is going to happen to my travelers or as part of my overall program. The other thing that I think we heard today is that data is relevant and it's not lost on companies like Lyft. There is more data and reporting and I would say transparency involved in your travelers getting into a Lyft car than there is if they're getting into a taxi. And that goes beyond safety and security to things like managing your spend as well as reporting that you may need to provide internally to your organization. So data is important. It's not lost in this world. and I would say is something that, again, you should continue to learn more about and understand how those reports and that additional information and transparency can feed into your programs and help you improve. And then the final piece here, which I think kind of goes without saying, is the innovation side. The travel industry, not to offend anyone because, again, I've been here for a long, long time, but we're not always necessarily known for being the most innovative from a technology perspective, right? And it's something as buyers we continue to push across all of our relationships to ask for more innovation and better ways and more efficient ways to do things as administrators as well as for our travelers. And I think the technologies that we're seeing come into play now with some of the shared economy suppliers, not just Lyft, but even on the accommodation side, for example, with Airbnb and their travel manager dashboard they've launched and their business-to-business offering, really, again, are just great examples of how there are additional capabilities on the technology side of things that are going to allow us all to do our jobs better and hopefully allow the travelers to have a better experience. I think at this point we're at the end, and hopefully from a timing perspective it looks like we did a pretty good job. We were trying to leave about 15 minutes to allow people to ask questions, and I'll let Wendy pick up because she's been moderating some of the questions that might have come in online as well.
Yeah, thanks, Theresa. Thanks, everybody. We did get some good questions, so I would like to start with one from Melissa. And that question came in and says, how can Lyft and the client's commercial general liability insurance policies both be primary as respects the other? Apparently, this is required in Lyft's agreement.
How can both Lyft and the company's liability policy be primary? Meaning like the corporation that we'd be working with?
It says Lyft and the client's commercial general liability insurance policies. Does that make sense to you?
I believe so. So the idea here is obviously we have our auto liability policy, which is going to cover any sort of liability arising out of the use of the auto, so our drivers in connection with the auto. If there's anything outside of that that is not covered by your traditional commercial liability policy, Lyft does carry a general liability policy, which would ultimately step into play as well. So I don't know that we would look in the situation of any sort of liability arising out of the use of the auto that would ultimately fall under the auto coverage. But if there's anything outside of that, ultimately it would fall under our general liability policy, which we do provide and is available in all the contracts that we have put in place. So I don't know that we would look for their policy to respond on behalf of any acts arising out of our driver.
Okay, thanks. David, I believe this one is for you. It says, so the criminal and driving record checks discussed are specific to U.S. states and perhaps territories as well. But what about checks undertaken by the international partner organizations? How can we feel the same comfort with using Lyft partners overseas?
That's an excellent question. I do not have that information in front of me right now on all of the background check procedures that are conducted by our international partners, but I would be happy to get that for you. I would expect that the immediate answer would be our partners overseas are some of the largest and most established transportation providers in the business, and I would expect that they are fully in compliance with local regulations and laws that govern the industries for all providers in the space. But we would be happy to provide additional information on that point following this call. I appreciate the question.
Okay. This one is about the vehicle inspections, and it is who does them and how often are they done?
David, did you want to take that?
Sure. So vehicle inspections depend on, most states are built on the same framework that grew out of California, but there are nuances in place. So in some states, the inspections are conducted by ASE certified mechanics, and they are done annually. In other states, the inspections are conducted by mentors that work with Lyft, and they are also conducted annually. So it really depends on the state and the laws that they have in place there. But in all cases, the vehicles are inspected. They all go through the same 19-point inspection and are usually subject to an annual review.
To piggyback off that
Okay.
as well, I think it's important to note that in the event that an accident does take place on the platform, every driver, regardless of severity, is automatically deactivated from the platform until Lyft has a chance to fully evaluate the incident, and as well as, if it is sort of a minor fender bender, ensure that the driver has provided us detailed pictures and invoices showing that they have fully repaired their vehicle. So we do take, vehicle safety incredibly it's seriously here, and so we do make sure that after any sort of incident that takes place on the platform, we take all the necessary steps to bring that vehicle back. And it's,
Yeah. I think one more thing on that as well, because it's important to remember the layers, right? So again, vehicle inspections are good and necessary, or they are enshrined and codified in every single operating market we're in. However, one thing that Lyft has that traditional providers do not have, whether it be a limousine, a black car service, or a taxi, is that in every single ride you get out, and how many other taxis have you gotten out of them and like, man, that was a real rattle trap, it smelled like gas, it wasn't nice, it was an unpleasant experience, this car is clearly not something I would want to drive my family around in. If that happens on our platform, you immediately have the opportunity to provide feedback, provide low stars, and people love to do that. You are then receive an auto prompt. Why did you provide less than an exemplary experience? Was it because of safety? Was it because of navigation? Was it because of the vehicle? Anything else? And then the system automatically guides you through. It wants to find out what the problem is. And if it is, I think the vehicle is unsafe, it rattles, it just feels wrong to me, they are immediately also off-boarded and brought in for a review to make sure something has happened. Make sure something has not happened to the vehicle that would make it insufficient for the purposes and safety on the platform. And that is an enormous breakthrough. I mean, it is that type of corporate or that type of community feedback is what is allowing fantastic platforms like Amazon or Etsy or others to really produce a positive consumer experience, and it has been tremendously powerful for us. So it's important to think about the entire thing in context when we're looking at safety.
Okay, we're drilling down into some details here now. So talking about that, do you have local supervision in person? Let's say a supervisor to attend an incident immediately per 100 drivers in a particular city, for example.
So we have local GMs in some of the markets that we operate in. I'm not sure if there's a specific to like an incident happening, but if anything were to take place, we obviously do have a dedicated third-party administrator who has offices locally in all the markets that we operate in, and are able to, if an incident were to take place, send a local investigator to that area. But we do have local general managers in most of the markets that we operate in as well. And then, of course, we have the dedicated 24/7 trust and safety team, as well as a critical response line that is available to all.
Okay, I want to shift direction here just a little bit. The question came in of, I'm a travel manager, so how would I begin to engage with Lyft in having a, quote, managed travel discussion?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So, as I alluded to a few times, we do have a very collaborative approach. So it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. We really take the time to learn about each specific prospective partner's challenges and goals, and then customize the strategy based on their travel needs. So, we would just urge you, if you do want to learn more, to reach out to us following the call, and we'll definitely get you connected with the right person on our end to start having that conversation, and then we can help you through the entire process.
Okay, and Jaden, earlier in the conversation you mentioned something about cost savings. So can you talk about what that means for the enterprise client?
Yeah, definitely. So I think first and foremost, the by far the biggest savings opportunity from working with us on a preferred partnership are the built-in savings that I talked about before, where it's 30% less expensive than taxi cabs, around 50% less expensive than black cars. And we actually have pricing calculators on our website. So if you visit the website, you can enter a pickup location and a drop-off location and see what a price of a Lyft would be, and then compare that to what the cost of a cab would be or a black car provider. And from that alone, I think you'll see the biggest opportunity in terms of how much you can save. As I think a lot of you guys are aware, we're an incredibly low margin business. So, you know, we take a very small percentage of every single ride. The vast majority goes directly back to the driver's pocket. So as a result, because of the way our revenue model is structured, we don't have a lot of room to play with in terms of negotiated rates. However, we do want to work closely with all of our partners. So we have done things like volume-based rates or volume-based prime time protection. So, you know, it's all on a circumstantial basis, and we're happy to talk with each individual partner about, you know, what they would value.
Okay, I want to respect people's time. Just wanted to point out what is coming up next month in our webinar series, and we will be talking about medical emergencies abroad. In that discussion, we will have AXA assistants on the call with us to discuss how you might handle some medical emergencies and what to look for. I appreciate everybody's time on the call. Thank you, Jaden, Melissa, and David, and Theresa for all of the great discussion, and look forward to seeing all of you on another call.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye.